And welcome to another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum where all voices matter. ESG, or Environmental, Social, and Governance, refers to criteria and standards for a company's operations that socially conscious investors use to screen potential investments. Currently, ESG models are all the rage, but as a recent report concludes, all is not clear in the Canadian energy sector. With us to explain are Marla Orenstein, she's the Director, National Resources Centre, Canada West Foundation, David Malia, Director and CEO of the Canadian Energy and Climate Nexus, and Dinara Millington, founder of 17 Insight Inc. And welcome to you all.
Thanks so much, Tony.
Thank you.
I'm going to we've got three folks here on my screen, so I'm going to try to herd the cats here a little bit. Maybe start with Marla, but everybody else is going to have their chance too. But I'd love to get from you what you consider to be a major finding in this report that's called ESG and the Canadian energy sector.
Well, thanks so much, Tony. We were really interested in doing this report because as you alluded to, there's a lot of hype and attention right now around ESG, but also a lot of confusion as to how companies should proceed. Is it a fad? Is it something to take seriously? How important is it to do? And to what extent are Canadian energy companies doing it? So the top line finding I'll hit you with has to do with the extent to which Canadian energy companies are actually doing ESG reporting right now, meaning publicly. When we looked at the oil and gas sector around the really big major companies, 100% of them are putting out public ESG reports. But when we fall away from the top companies, this really drops down. If we look at a more random sample of smaller oil and gas companies, it's only around 20%. And when we looked at other energy subsectors, it wasn't a ton higher. There was about a third of wind and solar companies that we took a look at who produced these reports, around 70% or so of electric utilities, and maybe around half of pipeline companies. So it's being done. People are definitely on the bandwagon, but it's not universal either in terms of its uptake or its quality.
David, let me ask you the same question. Major conclusions, surprising conclusions, what jumps out at you?
Thanks, Tony. You know, we helped sponsor this study and we brought on Dinara to work on it. And the intent was to kind of give a non-biased guideline where people could look at what ESG could be and maybe get a sense of how to de-risk their position. And to be honest, when I look at the report, I've been inundated from folks that after reading it are still quite confused as to what is the right answer, to be quite honest. What should my company do? They see what other companies are doing. And so to me, when I look at that report and I see that a large number of traditional energy companies like fossil fuel type of companies are doing a large portion of the reporting, and some of the others that traditionally you would say have or should have a strong ESG position aren't, like renewable companies. I don't think we can jump to the conclusion that automatically one has a really good record, one doesn't, or vice versa, but rather that the intent behind ESG reporting and doing it right potentially still needs a little bit of work to be done with regards to operationalizing something that's authentic for decision making and in a way that in particularly resonates with investors, so that they feel comfortable that they understand what's going on. So really the report has been astounding for generating conversation as to where and how a company could be with their peers, depending where they work. But I still see a lot of should we, shouldn't we, are we leaders, are we laggards? And I'm not sure that was the intent of the report in the first place, but rather to give people things to think about to de-risk their decision making. But that's what I've been hearing from the report. I'm very pleased as a sponsor of it to have these conversations occurring. But that really stood out to me is the folks that some folks would say aren't the ones that should be experts in doing ESG are the ones that are showing the most volume in knowing and doing. And the ones that you would automatically assume should be doing this, or should be experts, potentially have so much goodwill that don't feel the need to be doing it. So it's been interesting to see that in an unbiased manner.
I'm going to go to Dinara, but we only have about 20 seconds left before the break, so I don't want to mess her up by cutting her off. But so David, quick point. So from your perspective, though, it was important to do this research, clearly.
Yeah, super important because there are so many ESG reports out there happening. And the reason we did it was to try to create a report that could be used by all stakeholders, that wouldn't be biased to either a political outcome or an industry outcome.
Sure. And welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, as always, Tony Clement, here with Marla Orenstein and David Milia, and also Dinara Millington, all talking about ESG goals in the energy sector. Dinara, now's your time to shine. You've been waiting patiently. Something that David said, that things are, what he noticed was how confusing it all was for business leaders. Maybe tell us a little bit about that and anything else you want to talk and highlight about the report.
Sure. Thank you so much, Tony. I think the biggest takeaway for me in doing this research is understanding that how immature this field still is, and how much work is being done on international and even Canadian scale for Canadian energy sector, but as well as the investment community. There are over 600 different ESG rating agencies around the world. There are 6 globally recognized ESG frameworks that are not standardized and are very unique to depending on which sector the company operates in. And so, the biggest takeaway for me, and that I sort of would go out to the world with and make a recommendation to the Canadian energy sector, is to sort of, tread lightly, start slow, but this is something that is here to stay. And it's something that Canadian companies, not only just energy companies, but any companies, public or private companies, would have to start addressing, not just within their financial performance, but also in their operational performance when it comes to the impact that the companies have with their operations on the environment and the communities that they touch, but also for addressing things like access to capital, for example, from the investment community.
Yeah, and I do want to, that's exactly my next question, and I'm going to stick with you, Dinara, and then go around the wheel another time. But what are the things that ESG can do to enhance operations and profitability for companies?
There are solid. There's a solid business case for the Canadian energy sector to embrace ESG reporting and ESG performance. And some of the concrete benefits and results that we were able to take away from research and from interviewing the companies are increase in the operational efficiency of the company's projects, retention of talented and highly skilled personnel and staff. There's some correlation that we were able to identify between the company's ESG and their financial performance. So I think that's an area of still under development in terms of really identifying those statistical relationships. So stay tuned for that. But even if the softer impacts and softer benefits are already being highlighted, not just by the companies, but by the community, I think it's only going to get stronger. There's going to be an only stronger business case going forward. There's definitely a limit to what ESG can do in terms of the overall impact on when it comes to the environment and net zero ambitions of various governments. But there is a room, there's a business case for ESG and companies embracing it.
Marla, is that the way you see it too, that it's an obvious business case for these companies?
I do. I think there is an obvious business case as more and more capital is devoted to ESG performance. But at the same time, it doesn't make it easy. There's a lot of confusion going on out there. Dinara spoke about the 600 different frameworks and rating agencies. And it can feel like a bit of a game sometimes for companies that they are having to chase after different rating agencies and different ways of doing things and different reporting and different metrics. And that it can feel less about their performance and more about disclosing appropriately that in a way that makes them fit into those frameworks. And it's not necessarily poor performance on the environmental or social or governance front that is a problem for them. it's if it doesn't disclose in a way that matches a particular framework, they're not going to receive ratings that are as high, and that will affect how much funding flows to them. So I can understand why companies are confused and frustrated, even as they're trying to do the right thing.
David, we've only got about 30 seconds left, so I'm going to give you the top of the pops next time. But you think that there's a case to be made for Canadian energy companies on this?
Oh, absolutely. And I think the world's going to require it in a more rigid manner going forward. So doing something that de-risks our position going forward will be critical going into the near future and for years to come if we're going to be successful in energy as a Canadian player.
And we're back here at Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Marla Orenstein and David Milia and Dinara Millington, talking about ESG, particularly with respect to the Canadian energy sector. David, I'm going to go to you next. And this is something that I think all three of you have been alluding to. Let me put it that way, but I want to sort of face it head on. Obviously, I guess one of the questions a company may ask is, does this really, can it really make a difference, or am I just ticking off the boxes to make sure that I'm not the target of a Twitter fury or something? So why don't we go through, what is real and what is fanciful, if you will. David, why don't you start?
Sure. So I think we have a long history since the Brundtland Report on sustainability sort of reports that were seen as a goodwill exercise potentially. And the rigidity from the international sector for investment, in particular for companies that have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders, has made ESG start to transform into first what I would call a risk mitigation position,
right,
where we have to say, what is our risk as a company to not do this? Where now funding is drying up, and there's clear evidence of funding from private markets drying up for companies that don't have some approximation to strong ESG proposition. And eventually that tends to turn, like we've seen in other cases like safety, into operational metrics that are similar to what benchmarks are we going to hit for the year for the company for a wealth creation or strategic expansion of our operation. So ESG, eventually we can sort out all the different regulations and rating systems and have some rigidity. That's sort of the end destination. But the effects of fiduciary responsibility, which are structured under corporate governance today, is something that a company can't ignore right now and needs to have some form of response and make a good decision for where they'll stand on ESGs.
Dinara, are you worried about greenwashing, or are there proper accountability mechanisms in place?
There's definitely some development. One of particular note to talk about is the European Union.
Right.
As of May of this year, they've implemented greenwashing rules within the bounds of the companies that they regulate. On closer to home in Canada, the Canadian Corporate Act is looking at changing some elements of what companies disclose and how they disclose information. And it's all to prevent greenwashing and to prevent companies beefing up their green efforts and making sure that it is in fact, the company truly is having a significant impact when it comes to their environmental performance, governance, and social impact. So I think it's only a matter of time before Canada will be facing similar regulations as what we're seeing happen in the European Union. And currently today, the Canadian companies that do want to operate within the confines of the European Union are already facing these new regulations and facing the definition of what does it mean of having ESG-led investment and how it's classified.
Right, right. Marla, how should investors react to ESG claims?
I think that investors should certainly take note of what's happening, but also keep in mind what the limits are that ESG can deliver. ESG is the latest iteration of something that's happened in the past. I mean, we had triple bottom line with people, planet, and profits. We had CSR, corporate social responsibility. Those things were both important in making strides and in having companies act in a way that was beyond just being bound to their shareholders. This has more stickiness and more momentum behind it. It's aligned with other things that are happening, with shareholder activism, with stock markets moving towards certain types of disclosure. I think that there's more things that are happening on the whole that are moving towards keeping companies more accountable to a broad group of stakeholders. But at the same time, this isn't everything. I think about, for example, Coca-Cola and the fact that it gets great ESG ratings because of various boxes that it ticks off, but still fundamentally its main business has to do with the selling of sugary beverages. So ESG isn't going to solve all the questions or all the issues that people might have about companies, but it is a way of moving the bar up for everybody at the same time. And I think that's a good thing.
We're going to take another brief break. I do want to raise the specter, since I can't avoid it, of the federal election and how this plays into that. So get yourselves ready for that. But we will take this short break and we'll be right back after these messages. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. We're talking about all things ESG and how it impacts on the energy sector with Marla Ornstein of Canada West Foundation, David Millia, Canadian Energy and Climate Nexus, and Dinara Millington, founder of 17 Insight Inc. David, start with you. Federal election on, obviously. Any thoughts on the party platforms and how they impact on the ESG sort of universe?
Yeah, in the sake of not pointing to anything that may look like I'm biased to one party or another, I'll say that what I'm looking for in the platforms is balance. Balance that looks at the energy security that we enjoy today while looking at a transition that actually has a viable way of implementation. So that we look at the lessons learned of precipitating a transition that's not ready, where the taxpayer has to pay for that change. Examples in Ontario that we've seen in the past, where your electrical bill goes up by 400%. We want to avoid that. Likewise, there are some challenges with the way that we have our energy security today that we should do better on. And ESG can be a critical tool in doing that. Now, clarity from a regulatory body that's linked to whichever party we elect that has balance and saying, we can add some clarity to how you should report and do ESGs in a manner that promotes business and promotes the protection of the public. That's what I'm looking for in each of the platforms.
Okay. Dinara, same question. If you were Prime Minister, what would you do?
Well, I think I will echo David's comment. I'm looking for a just and equitable transition. And I'm talking about energy transition and the ambitious goal of Canadian government and some of the parties that are supporting that, of eliminating greenhouse gas emissions. But in the meantime, we got to do it. We got to do it right. We got to have a pathway that is just and equitable, and that we are incorporating all the different communities, all the different companies, and all the various stakeholders that will be impacted by this.
Marla, is that possible? I mean, do you see some signs that the parties are shifting to that kind of discussion?
Well, I certainly echo what both David and Dinara said, that clarity that can give confidence in an energy transition is something that's going to help float all boats in Canada when it comes to ESG. It's something that will provide credibility for Canadian companies in the claims that they make in terms of ESG. I know that ESG is something that's caught the attention of both federal and provincial governments. It intersects a little bit differently with each, but there's a lot of role that governments have to play that have nothing to do with the politicking and nothing to do with which party wins. For example, governments are really important at providing information about companies, monitoring information, energy information, statistical information. And if they're able to collect and disseminate information in a way that makes it easier for companies to report ESG instead of having different things going in different directions, again, it just helps everybody. And that's not an issue of liberal versus conservative versus NDP. That's just a question of the function of government. So I think there's going to continue to be a role, again, at both a provincial and federal level, no matter what the outcome of the election is.
David, sorry, go ahead. Yeah, Dinara, go
If
ahead.
I could just throw one comment, I think governments are also would be a right place where we can implement the right kind of policy levers and the right kind of policy tools that would aid in order to sort of achieve various goals.
Absolutely. David, would you agree with that analysis?
Absolutely. I think the challenge isn't their role, it's getting it right and getting it into a state that respects the province's ability to make their decisions with regards to the access to their minerals or whatever resources they may have. In a country where the perception is it's easier to do business as a province with another nation than it is sometimes to do business with another province.
Right.
And so that is something that both federal and provincial governments could really look to improve. And ESG could give them a bit of a platform to find some common playing ground to do that.
I can't believe it, but our time is up. Thank you very much. You've been very engaging guests, and I certainly wish you well with all of your work on this very important topic. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much, Tony. Take care.
Thanks to our guests for joining us today. Very interesting topic on environmental, social, and governance issues, which is going to be part of our public dialogue. There's no question about it, for corporations, for governments, and for citizens. And thanks for watching today.